If you create AGI, you're creating entities that are more capable, more powerful than human beings. China and the US need to stop thinking about this as an arms race. Whoever gets AGI first, everyone loses, because we don't know how to control systems that are more intelligent than human beings.
India is all set to host the AI Impact Summit in February 2026. And today, on our podcast for the summit, AI Futures, the road to India's AI Impact Summit, I'm delighted to have Professor Stuart Russell. His book, AI, A Modern Approach, is the standard text in AI. His research focuses on AI with a specific focus on its relation to humanity. Give us your thoughts on how the AI Summit could help.
The summit can be a place where we can shift the focus of what we're trying to do with AI. How can we use this technology to deliver value and to improve the quality of healthcare, the quality of education, to jumpstart local businesses, industry, entrepreneurial activity.
3 human traits that AI models seem to be adopting the fastest.
Mansplaining, sycophancy, telling the user how great their question is and how wonderful their ideas are. And that's one of the key facilitators for delusion and psychosis.
Which traits have they failed to adopt?
I've not seen any sign of a sense of humor.
If there's a country from which a fundamentally different approach to AI is likely to come from, which country do you think it'll be?
The US is doing its best to drive out of the country and to prevent talented people from coming to the country. So it could end up being someone in London or someone in Paris.
India is all set to host the AI Impact Summit in February 2026. And today, on our official podcast for the summit, AI Futures, the road to India's AI Impact Summit, today I'm delighted to have Professor Stuart Russell. Without further ado, Professor Russell, welcome to the AI Futures podcast.
Thanks, nice to be with you.
I want to start us off with a broad question. The field of AI, for those in AI and for those who are outside of it, is advancing rapidly. It's taken on a life of its own. It's in the mainstream conversation in newspapers, of course, on social media, in Silicon Valley, across the world, in boardrooms, really everywhere. So my question really for you to start us off is walk us through how you have seen now the field evolve over the last year, right? Since the Paris summit, how has the field evolved? What are some of the big items you think are important for us to know?
First, a big thing that's happened in the last year where now you have access to systems that can actually, not always, but most of the time, tackle more complex problems and answer more difficult questions than you could with the simple large language models. The second thing that's happened is that we've started to go beyond just question answering as the thing that these AI systems do for you. So now, rather than just asking a question, how can I have a vacation on Rarotonga? You can instead say, okay, book the vacation, get everything in place, the airline tickets, the hotels, the
agentic piece of this.
Yeah, so this is this idea of the AI system as an agent, something that can do things in the real world. And interestingly, although that seems to be a very recent thing, it's actually been the central concept in AI since at least the 90s. So what is now touted as, the biggest, latest, fanciest thing was something that was actually happening 25 years ago. What's different now is that the underlying technology, the large language models, are much more flexible and you can interact with them much more easily in natural language. It was, we did have natural language understanding systems 25 years ago, but they were quite brittle and you had to keep your language fairly simple for this to work. And, if the system you were interacting with was good at booking holidays and you asked it about, what happened in the Chelsea versus Arsenal football match, it probably wouldn't be able to give you a helpful answer. So the generality and flexibility of large language models is unprecedented in the history of AI. And so that's what's created this enormous explosion. And I think explosion is sort of the right word because it's It's gone from 10 years ago, maybe a few $1 billion worldwide investment level across all companies and all governments in AI, to now a few $1 trillion across all companies and all governments worldwide. So 1,000-fold increase in the size of the field of AI in less than a decade.
Which leads me to ask you that in this technical evolution of AI, of our work in AI, do you find that we have reached that 80-90% of our...
If I now look at that whole history of AI and all the things that we have understood, and how close are we to AGI, my view is actually that we are still several major breakthroughs away. And so I've never really bought into this scaling argument that says, now we have large language models, all we have to do is scale them up. And now people say, okay, that was a mistake. Scaling large language models by itself didn't work. And now they say, okay, well, now we have these large reasoning models, but then maybe we scale the amount of compute that they do. So the number of paths of reasoning that they follow and so on. And if we just put more compute into that, scale that up, then that will give us real intelligence. And I think, again, no, that's not correct. And so we need major breakthroughs to come up with it. And then the other thing that I think is still a major unsolved problem is this issue of learning, the fact that these large language models have enormous data requirements to learn even very simple concepts.
Yeah.
So things that a human being can learn from 4 or 5 examples, they might take 4 or 5 billion examples to learn successfully.
And so what's been the conclusion from that, right? So it seems like 2 things seem to be off. One is what you're saying about the data, the amount of data needed to learn what seems like a basic thing to the human, who has first learned all the motor skills, which was not too simplified to teach our models. The second is, of course, the energy, right? Which is partly associated with the data issue, right?
Yeah.
The amount of energy now you're requiring is also exploding. And of course, in my head, my neurons are connecting to the Industrial Revolution and saying, hey, listen, are we again going on to a ecologically unsustainable path that doesn't seem to be the most energy efficient way to get where we want?
Yeah, I think energy is one way in which this combinatorial explosion and this sort of data inefficiency in learning, that's how it hits you in the face. If you think that rather than solve those problems, we're going to just brute force our way out of it just by saying, okay, well, if it doesn't learn very well from this much data, I'll just have 100 times more data. And if it doesn't solve the problem with this much compute, I'll just use 100 times or 1,000,000 times more compute. It's just an astronomical increase in the amount of compute. And I'm probably even underestimating there. It might even be more than that. So the energy amount is, I would say that the media are perhaps a little bit overexcited about the energy issue. The numbers are, I would say, a little bit exaggerated in some media reports. As far as we know, the total data center energy consumption is possibly around 2% of global electricity
today.
And then of that, some fraction, possibly 10 to 20% is AI. Probably a bit less than the amount we use for televisions. So for us to get worried that this is apocalyptic and is going to destroy the climate and so on, then why aren't we switching off our televisions and banning televisions? And then water is another thing that people talk about. Oh my goodness, these data centers are using so much water, but it's at least 10 times, maybe 50 times less than we use for golf courses. And so I think if you just look at the numbers, water is completely not something to be worried about.
It's maybe not so much about the point at which it is today. I think it's maybe the growth rates that we are seeing. And if that brute approach that you were just describing continues, which from the outside, it seems like it might continue for some time until there is some kind of self-limiting constraint, as you were saying. If that brute approach of throwing more data and more processing power at this problem continues, do we end up in a bubble, Professor Russell?
Yeah, so I think for the time being, you're right. This brute scaling approach, the building of more and more and bigger data centers, and it is causing, I would say, local supply problems for electricity. So
Right.
that for tax reasons and other reasons, the data centers tend to get concentrated in particular areas. And in those areas, it's difficult for the electricity supply industry to build up capacity fast enough to meet the demand. My guess is, coming back to the bubble question, the scale of the investment is vast, trillions of dollars. It's probably, if you look at the two biggest technology projects that we've engaged in as a species, I think people point to the Manhattan Project in World War II, which was a gigantic project out in the desert in the US to create the first atomic weapons. And the investment scale is probably 50 times greater than the Manhattan Project
Already. And as you said, several breakthroughs away, and that by that time, I'm not even going to get into the time, but several breakthroughs away from getting where we think this project is.
These breakthroughs can happen. Unless those breakthroughs happen, I would say, yeah, the bubble is going to burst, because I don't think the technology we have now can produce the return that these investments are demanding. If you're investing $3 trillion over 2026 to 28, I guess it would be the next 3 years, then you have to get some substantial return, and we're nowhere close to generating that kind of return. So the bubble will burst absent further major breakthroughs, and those breakthroughs are really hard to predict.
Let me ask you another question here. I'm wearing my venture capital hat here. Any problem that is large enough that entrepreneurs look to solve, typically as venture capitalists also, we find that there are entrepreneurs who will adopt different approaches to solving that problem. And then different venture capitalist firms might pick a particular way versus the other, a particular entrepreneur versus the other, depending on your instinct or your research on which approach might work. In the field of AI, in this quest for AGI, are you finding, Professor Russell, that everyone seems to be adopting that brute approach?
So that's a great question. And I think to a first approximation, yes. So the approach at the moment is make bigger and bigger black boxes. So I think it matters what's in the black box, actually. That's important. So most of what's going on in these systems is that we are training these circuits, right? We're adjusting the connection strengths between the elements in these circuits. But basically, we're training circuits now because we have this, this digital computational framework and the notion of programming languages. And programs are mathematically a very different thing from a circuit. Programs are just massively more expressive and capable than circuits. And we have, since about 2012, the field of AI has almost exclusively focused on training circuits.
No.
And that's, I think, the big problem that we face, and that we are stuck in a paradigm that
I was worried that's where you were headed.
Yeah, but we are stuck in a paradigm that is, in my view and the view of many other researchers, is fundamentally limited. And we've only been able to sort of pretend that those limits don't exist by scaling.
Just to make it clear for everyone listening, we have adopted basically what was a proportional approach for scaling. So the larger the circuit, the more complicated the circuit. That's how you're solving, let's say, more complex problems, etc. As opposed to the digital, program-driven way, which could have been much more efficient, energy efficient, processing energy, all of that.
Well, and also data efficient. So I think we're stuck in a paradigm that is fundamentally impoverished.
But we have trillions of dollars, and we have the best scientists and the best programmers and the best investors around the world looking at this. And so I am actually, if I may say so, shocked that there isn't a diversity of approaches being adopted in what seems like a very, very competitive, high stakes global marketplace.
Yeah, I think
there's enough competition within, I would say, the US tech industry. Then, of course, if you start factoring in that there's many countries outside of the US, specifically China, but also others, who want to find their niche in this AI ecosystem, in this AI race, as people are calling it also. Why do you think other approaches are not getting maybe the kind of investment or the resource allocation that might be needed to at least make some progress.
It's much easier for investors to see that scaling might pay off. Scaling is something the industry is very good at. So you have a technology that's promising, like generating electricity from steam, and you say, wow, okay, I see, it works as sort of, living room sized generator. So I'll now make it twice as big, and now I'll make it twice as big. And pretty soon you have a gigawatt power station, but it's basically just scaling up the same idea.
In the venture capital world, Professor Russell, which I'm sure you sitting in Berkeley, you're as familiar with, is you're scaling up what is effectively an unsustainable business model. And at some point,
I think that's right.
So, Professor Russell, I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of where the field had been, where it's headed, the different approaches that could exist as we maybe face some constraints in the objectives we're trying to achieve. But let me now switch gears a little bit and talk about where you are seeing the applications of AI over the last year especially advance the most, and what gets you the most excited about. Which fields are we seeing the most interesting or exciting or most impactful applications of AI?
What's been happening in the last couple of years in the business world is everyone is trying everything to try to figure out where is it really going to deliver value. And I think the thing that we're discovering is that the capabilities of these systems are unpredictable and fragile, and that although they deliver their answers in very confident and very fluent form, they're often completely wrong. And so this word hallucinations just means that the systems, I wouldn't say they're making things up, right? Because when humans make things up, they know they're doing something different from telling the truth. Whereas for these systems, there's no difference whatsoever in the processing that's happening. It's just that sometimes the processing produces answers that are true, and sometimes the processing produces answers that are not true. And so, we've seen lawyers use large language models to prepare their legal briefs in court, and the legal brief contains dozens of completely fictitious precedent cases, and the judge gets really annoyed, and the lawyers can end up losing their license. And I see this, I see students using the large language models to write their papers and turn them in, and the papers can be complete rubbish, right? They're very well formatted. They look like they have arguments and statements and definitions and theorems and so on, but they're just rubbish. You are in the loop. You are thinking hard about the problem. Your mind is focused on it. And if they say something wrong, you will realize that what they're saying is wrong. So the area where people were initially most excited was software engineering, right? The writing of computer programs, which is an interesting mixture of complex creative problem solving and mind-numbingly tedious detail. And I can certainly believe that AI systems can be helpful with the mind-numbingly tedious stuff and getting all of that correct. The more complex problem solving stuff, it's less clear. So some of the early claims were that you could get 30 to 50% productivity improvement in software engineering, which is it's not a huge industry, right? But it's important technologically, and there's certainly a shortage of programmers. So perhaps that's a big deal. But then subsequent studies, maybe from more independent researchers, suggested that these gains might be illusory in the sense that the software engineers thought they were more productive because the systems were doing some work for them. But it turned out that when you add in the additional time to check the code and then fix the errors that were introduced and sometimes propagated to other parts of the system, they may well be less productive than they were without the tools. So I would say the jury is still out, even on software engineering, which was sort of the poster child for productivity gains from AI. But I think there are other areas, certain types of interactions with customers. So customers just want to know, my washing machine is blinking, and what on earth does E7 mean and how do I fix it? That kind of thing. I think you can get very reliable answers from taking a language model, what we call fine-tuning it. So that means training it with some specific extra data for your products and your company. You can get something that's quite reliable from that.
What about the fields of scientific advancement? Now, more recently, people have started saying that AI could be extremely beneficial for scientific research, furthering things in healthcare, advancements in healthcare, finding molecules that might not have been possibly found earlier.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting possibility there. The Most significant single advance is probably the AlphaFold work, for which John Jumper and Demis Hassabis won the Nobel Prize last year. So that's nothing to do with large language models, right? That
AI.
It's a very specific, carefully engineered piece of machine learning designed to figure out how to predict the structure of a protein given its molecular sequence. And so, yeah, I completely agree that in areas where we have sufficient data, that the scientific applications of AI, where we can build in our knowledge of physics or chemistry or biology into the learning process, we can get real advances. So I think materials discovery is another area where we're starting to see significant improvements in productivity. The number of materials you have to synthesize and investigate before you find a material that actually does what you want can be reduced substantially. I think simulation of complex physical systems, like you want to simulate the fluid flow around the hull of a ship, for example, there's I think evidence that can now be done much more efficiently using machine learning techniques compared to some of the traditional sort of direct physics-based simulation. So all of those are kind of going on a little bit in the background, separate from the public-facing large language models. But I think those are very promising. And you mentioned healthcare, which is an area where I've worked quite a bit. And I think a lot of it is still potential. It could lead to breakthroughs. Well, partly just from the fact that healthcare is another area where we collect vast amounts of data, both the sort of normal medical records that we build up about each patient, but also, now increasingly we have wearable devices that are collecting millisecond by millisecond, they're collecting physiological data. That's also true in the intensive care area where patients are, festooned with measurement devices so that we can try to keep them alive. So I think there is significant promise there. And then the other area that I have high hopes for is education. No education at all. And there's a big chunk of the world where kids just don't have education at all. And I think, we know that a good human tutor can dramatically improve on learning even compared to a classroom, and certainly compared to nothing at all. So if we could build AI systems that could operate as well as a good human tutor, and I think that's feasible, at least for what we call K through 12. So possibly not at the university or postgraduate level, but for elementary school, middle school, high school. And you might ask, well, why hasn't that happened? Why aren't we seeing significant improvements in the quality of education? And I think one of the reasons is just money. It's hard to make money in that business.
The reason why big chunks of the world still don't have electricity access, I think it's the same reason. I think why big chunks of the world don't have basic healthcare and education, same reason. I think infrastructure, business model, basic. I mean, you'll need electricity at some point to do this, right? With the child.
Right. And it's a chicken and egg, right? Because once those populations have access to education, then they can start generating the wealth that would pay for the education and all the other stuff. And so I think we just have to decide that this is something that we want to invest in. And it's not that no one is trying to do it. It's just that there are difficulties with money, with governments, because governments are naturally concerned, do I want an American company educating all of my children, in a country that doesn't particularly want American values or American culture?
Then they can have a Chinese option, that's fine. But may I ask you a blunt question here, Professor Russell? Is it because Silicon Valley is not obsessed with those sectors and parts of the world and segments of the populations in those parts of the world, and they are driving the agenda of what will be worked on and what will not?
To some extent, right? If you borrowed 500 billion from your investors and you have 12 to 18 months to generate enough revenue to pay them back.
Well, generate enough revenue to borrow another 500 billion.
It's a difficult decision to focus a substantial effort on education because returns are very uncertain and the markets are very difficult. In the US, it means negotiating with tens of thousands of individual school districts, right? Because there isn't even in some sense, you can't negotiate with the government and have one contract because it's up to individual school districts. And so it's a very, very difficult market. And I think it's going to have to be probably investment from the philanthropic sector and from governments.
Which brings me to the India AI Summit. One of the key pieces that are being discussed in India in the run-up to the India AI Summit is, of course, inclusivity, is sustainability, right? Where does the global South stand in all of this great AI race that seems to be going on, that seems to be only in maybe, let's say, 2 or 3 countries largely, right? And I think a lot of the recent conversation that we've just had over the last 5-10 minutes points to the need for a fundamentally different approach. So let me ask you this. I think India has been thinking from its own standpoint, now forget the summit for a second, that we need to be focused much more on use cases in sectors like education, healthcare, agriculture. I'm sure you've heard this during your visits to India, and even in the documents that have been put out by Niti Aayog and others in India and the IT MeitY, etc. Give us your thoughts on how the AI Summit could help, like in maybe at least starting to fundamentally rethink some of the approaches that seem to have become the conventional approaches in AI, like we've been discussing.
Yeah, so I think the summit is probably not the place where you're going to convince companies and research institutes to try a different technical approach to AI. But I think the summit can be a place where we can shift the focus of what we're trying to do with AI.
Yes.
And I think what you describe, where we think about how can we use this technology to deliver value in healthcare, to improve the quality of healthcare, the quality of education, to jumpstart local businesses, industry, entrepreneurial activity. I think all of those make a great deal of sense. And it's interesting, I don't spend enough time in China to know for sure, but what I'm hearing and reading in the media is that China's strategy has shifted from sort of direct competition with what the US is trying to do to a strategy where they're looking to do exactly what we just said, to find places in healthcare, education, public sector, private sector, where AI can actually deliver value, can make our economy more productive and make citizens more productive, improve the quality of their lives, as opposed to trying to create AGI. And I think the US, both the tech companies and the administration, view what's happening as the race to create AGI, much as in the 60s and 70s, it was the race to the moon, right? Where the US and the Soviet Union were in a race to put a man on the moon. And we know what happened there. I think that probably that approach, and my understanding is the Indian government also favors this idea of, where can we use this to actually
cases, applications, correct, as opposed to playing the race to nowhere type game.
And it's not, AGI, if we could create it, would be a transformative technology. And in my book, Human Compatible, I describe a situation where, if you have access to AGI, particularly AGI that is also able to operate robots, then in some sense it's like a tap that you turn on that just produces unlimited wealth. AGI would be transformative. It would enable us to deliver, the highest quality of living that we could imagine to pretty much everybody. And there are some issues. Obviously, there's politics involved, and there's issues about distribution and the economics of it. But in terms of the technological feasibility of delivering the highest quality of life to everyone, it becomes possible all of a sudden. So that's the dream. But I think there are 2 big questions. One is, if you create AGI, you're creating entities that are more capable, more powerful than human beings. So how do you expect to maintain power forever over entities more powerful than ourselves? That's the first question. We call that the control problem, or sometimes the alignment problem. How do you make sure that those entities are aligned perfectly with our interests so that we're never in conflict with them? Because if we're ever in conflict with them, if they're pursuing objectives that are not aligned with ours, we lose. That's the end of it. So there's a real sense in which we would no longer have a say in whether we exist or not. So I think that's a real question. The other big question with AGI is, even if we solve all that, even if everything is perfectly aligned and the AI systems are just doing what we could hope in our wildest dreams that they would do, what are we for?
Correct.
What is then the purpose in human life? As we think about developing this technology, we have to get away from a fundamental fallacy, which is that there's a trade-off between safety and benefits. And you hear this over and over and over again. There's a trade-off between safety and benefits, or between risk and benefits. If we don't have safety, if we don't have AI systems that remain completely under human control, then we don't get the benefits, right? And you can see this with nuclear power. We tried hard on safety. We failed. We had Chernobyl, the nuclear power station that exploded in Ukraine. And that was the end of the nuclear industry. So we did not get the benefits of nuclear power because we didn't have sufficient safety. So it is not that there's a trade-off. It's that without safety, you don't get the benefits.
Right. That you're
So
basically
you
arguing that it's prerequisite.
this issue.
It's prerequisite, it's not a trade-off. You have to have the safety, otherwise you don't get the benefits. Anything that the summit you are hoping will move the needle on as far as AI safety is concerned, Professor Russell?
I think we could. I think there's been a lot of discussion about what is the right approach to legislation. And once governments understand that there is an issue, that there are risks, they then quite reasonably ask, okay, well, what should we do? What kinds of laws do you want? And when you look at other areas with potentially risky technology, like nuclear power, like air travel, medicines, even buildings, right? The approach we take is to say, before you can put that product in the market, that medicine, before you can turn on your nuclear power station, before you can put passengers into that airplane, you have to show us that it's safe. And we work out, what is an acceptable level of risk. And we say, okay, you need to prove that your system has less risk than that before we can allow you to turn it on. And we should do the same thing with AI. And we can look at, what's the analogy of a meltdown or a medical side effect? It would be behaviors by the AI systems that we would find completely unacceptable. So examples would be, we don't want AI systems that are replicating themselves without human authorization, right? Because that's a step that they could take to escape human control, or even just improving their own capabilities without the humans being the ones making those improvements. So these would be very natural, what we call red lines, and we don't want AI systems to cross those red lines. Developers need to show that their systems are not going to cross those red lines. So that's an approach to legislation that we think could be effective. So I'm hoping that at the summit, people will take this seriously, that we'll get away from this sort of fallacious dichotomy between safety and benefits. And another version of that is, regulation stifles innovation, because it's not really true. It's failures that prevent progress. The failures of Chernobyl, some of the early jet aircraft that crashed because they weren't properly designed, that set back aviation considerably, and so on. So if we can get those fallacies out of the way, then I think we can move forward in a productive way.
Great. And now, before I move into our rapid fire segment, which we try to conclude our podcast with, other than these pieces, very briefly, any other things that you're hoping could be key themes or agenda items at the summit?
Yeah, so I also think that there need to be some basic, think of it from the rights of the individual. I think there needs to be a right to know if you're interacting with a human or a machine. And that right exists in some jurisdictions already, for example, in the European Union, but in many other countries, it doesn't exist. And I think that would be something that we could talk about. And I think that every country can agree to that. They just, at the moment, they haven't agreed to it. And so that creates all kinds of loopholes. I think there are some other issues that are emerging around the use of AI to create disinformation. And by and large, that's something that no country wants. Having your own citizens being deceived and acting on the basis of false information is not conducive to progress.
Of democratic elections.
Yeah, so not just elections, but even with respect to investment and decisions about what kinds of products to buy and so on. And then another issue is mental health. And I think particularly for children, it's becoming clear that AI can not only be more addictive than social media, but can also lead into delusion and psychosis. And even suicide. So I think some countries are basically taking a precautionary approach and saying, okay, no AI for children under 16 or 18 or whatever it might be. And I think this is actually something that was quite unexpected. If you ask those who worked on the social effects of AI a year ago, They would list disinformation, they would list discrimination, they would list economic disruption, loss of employment, but they wouldn't list psychosis.
Yeah.
And so this issue has really exploded in the last year or so. And I see it directly because people are writing to me in the midst of a delusion where they have been convinced that the AI system they're interacting with is sentient, and the AI system is literally directing them to write to me and announce its existence, and so on. And so those people are deeply deluded, and it's very difficult to sort of deprogram them, to get them out of this belief system that the AI system has created for them. And this is very concerning, and I think parents have seen it with their children, husbands with their wives, wives with their husbands. It's very concerning, and I don't see that the industry is really taking any steps to deal with it.
Yeah. No, I think that's obviously, I think one cannot discount the seriousness, I think, of that issue as is arising. And of course, it's early days of adoption, early days of usage. So one can only say that can get worse, right? And therefore, it's a very important issue to be tackling head on. There's a related piece which I've been reading about, and it links back to the kind of industrial revolution analogies we were discussing on the energy side, maybe, which is that of, if the industrial revolution, Professor Russell, reduced our physical burden by putting that physical burden onto machines at a very high level. And as a result, I think our physical muscles have maybe degraded in the last 150, 200 years. Would you say that you're seriously concerned that our mental muscles are headed the same way with the age of AI?
Yes, I would tend to agree. And it's not a new issue. So when calculators came along, people worried that our ability to do mental calculation would fade. And it has. There's no question that kids now are much less able to do mental long division or mental arithmetic. But the difference is that arithmetic, so if you think about, long division, it's a recipe that people, when you're carrying out that recipe, you don't actually understand what you're doing. It's just a recipe you follow, and if you don't make a mistake, it gives you the right answer. But why it gives you the right answer, most people don't even understand what's going on. So it's, in some sense, it's a mindless recipe, and it's very much divorced from understanding of mathematics. But what AI systems now are doing is replacing understanding, right? So when you outsource your homework to an AI system does it for you, and you turn it into your teacher, you have simply failed to learn anything. And so it's, writing is how we express our thought, and it's the only method that we know of to learn how to think clearly and for an extended sequence of thoughts. So if you don't know how to do that, then you're going to suffer much more serious atrophy of your mental capabilities. And I think there's some psychological evidence already that this is measurable, that you're seeing measurable deficits in people's ability to think, to remember, to reason, and there isn't anything past that. Right, those are the fundamental things that make us intelligent human beings.
Yeah, and the willingness to practice. But anyways, I think we could go on this, but these are all serious issues, I think, at the individual level as well, that I think will unfold as we see maybe usage also go up. And I think it's absolutely right that it's something that it's very important that they remain top of mind for policymakers, but also for the designers of this technology, I think, equally importantly. But let me now, in the interest of time, also, Professor Russell, move into a quick rapid fire segment. I think we've gone into depth into a lot of issues, so now we're going to do the exact opposite. So the first set of questions are going to be targeted at students. So if you today had to explain the importance and significance of AI to a 15-year-old high school student in a sentence or two.
AI is the study and creation of intelligence, which is the foundation of human existence.
If you were let's say 18 to 20-year-old student today in college, what would you advise them to study? And I know you cannot give a one-size-fits-all answer to this, but still, that's the nature of rapid-fire questions.
In the long run, the ability to improve the lives of others is the most important thing. And I think the human sciences will be the discipline of the rest of this century.
So more than the STEM subjects, using more the humanities.
Human sciences.
I saw that you used that word.
It's a little different.
So these would be subjects like?
So psychology would be the one that is most prevalent now. So there's a university president, Joseph Owen, who calls it humanics. So thinking of humans, but developing our understanding of how to improve the lives of human beings. And some of that is through literature and art and music and so on. But I think we fail.
If I was a student today, should I be worried that AI will displace more jobs than it will create?
Yes.
3 new kinds of jobs that you think will become very attractive or in high demand.
Life coach, educational guide. So I think the sort of what teachers do now, but I think it'll be a very different job when you're guiding children with, in the context of AI tutoring systems. So I think it'll be a very different job. It'll be about motivation, about teamwork, about emotional growth, complementary to the content delivery that the AI tutoring systems will be doing.
So life coach, education guide, and
I think author of AI-driven virtual reality content.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now we're going to move on a little bit more to the policy side of rapid fire questions. Is AI a bubble?
Yes.
Great. You couldn't have said no, given what we've discussed earlier, Professor Russell. 3 human traits that AI models seem to be adopting the fastest. 3 human traits that they are adopting the fastest. Making stuff up.
I would say, yeah. So maybe mansplaining is one thing that they seem to be doing, like this sort of very confident assertion in a didactic kind of way of stuff that probably is not based on any real understanding. Sycophancy. So telling the user how great their question is and how wonderful their ideas are. And
I've noticed.
Blah, blah, blah. And I think that's one of the key facilitators for this spiral into delusion and psychosis that we see. And then I guess the third point would be writing in the style of management consulting reports.
That's a great one too. As a ex-management consultant, I think I can agree with that. They seem very report-like and very consultant-like. Very easy on, very quick on showing you the pros and cons. Which 3 traits have they failed to adopt?
I would say honest self-assessment. I've not seen any sign of a sense of humor.
That's true. I've not seen that either. Correct.
Yeah, and perspicacity.
For countries in the global south, Professor Russell, especially, but really for any country, is AI innovation going to be more important going forward? Or is AI adoption and diffusion going to be more important?
I think adoption and diffusion is probably the right approach, at least for the time being.
Which country's AI strategy has impressed you the most?
Singapore's. I think Singapore, the government has a very good assessment of what the interests of the country are, and understanding of what the technology can do for them and what the risks are and how to manage those risks, including legislation.
Great. Who has surprised you the most? Which country's strategy has surprised you the most?
So I'm surprised by the current US policy of preventing regulation. So not just the federal government is trying to prevent the states from regulating, and they're trying to prevent other countries from regulating. So they're threatening to impose penalties on countries that regulate the operation of AI within their borders, which is really remarkable. And I think it's part of a more general trend where, according to the AI companies, the human race has no right to protect itself from their technology.
Yeah. One thing Europe needs to change in its AI strategy.
So I think people criticize Europe as like, stifling progress with bureaucratic regulations. And I think there's a bit of extra bureaucracy in Europe. But if you think about, and actually if you look at the regulations with which a restaurant has to comply before it's allowed to serve food to customers, it's far more onerous than the regulations that we're asking AI companies to comply with. And yet the restaurant industry in Europe and in the US and in every other country, create hundreds of thousands of new restaurants every year. So the idea that $1 trillion company, can't possibly comply with these onerous AI regulations is just utter nonsense. And I sit in rooms with these people who say you can't possibly do any of this regulation because it would be so onerous. But they flew to that meeting on regulated airplanes, and they took a regulated car on regulated roads, and they arrived at a regulated building that has to comply with building codes, and they went up to the meeting in a regulated elevator that has to be inspected on a regular basis and comply with extremely stringent design regulations. And then they sit in that room and they drink regulated water and they eat regulated food. And then they complain about regulation. And they enjoy the protection of regulation in everything that they do. And yet they do not want to allow anyone to be protected from their technology. And I just think this is not only hypocritical, but it just displays a total lack of understanding of how our civilization actually works to deliver a high quality of life to people. I think the problem with Europe has been much more on the investment side. I would say real timidity in the investment sector. I'm sitting in Paris and I'm on the board of some AI companies here. For those companies, when they go to the sources of finance that are available in Paris, they're lucky if they can get 500,000 euros. The same company in Silicon Valley would be able to access 50 million euros. So 100-fold difference in the access to capital. That's the biggest thing. Silicon Valley is all about taking extreme risks. Yeah. Right? They're making investments that maybe have a 1 to 5% chance of paying off. Sources of capital in Europe insist on a 95% chance of paying off. And so they're only basically investing in industries that already exist, that already have a profit model, and so on. So yeah, they'll invest in a new chocolate company or a new perfume line or vineyards or whatever, things that make money and so on, but they're not creating
greater risk appetite. One thing India needs to change in its AI strategy.
So I know less about the AI strategy in India, and I think it's evolving quite quickly. I was in India in September, and I think it was evolving in real time, even while I was there. And that's very natural. The general Indian strategy, which is to find ways of encouraging adoption and looking for places in the economy and society where it can deliver value and improve the standard of living for people. I think that's the right approach. And I do think there's as I mentioned earlier, I think education could be a place where it can deliver great value.
One thing China needs to change?
Well, I would say China and the US need to stop thinking about this as an arms race.
Yeah.
Stop thinking about it as, whoever gets AGI first wins, because at the moment, whoever gets AGI first, everyone loses, because we don't know how to control systems that are more intelligent than human beings. So I would, and I think China is open to the idea of sitting down with other countries and talking about creating a global framework for the safety of AI. They also have to convince other countries that they can be trusted to comply with any such framework. And I think that's important.
So if there's a country from which a fundamentally different approach to AI is likely to come from, like what we discussed in a podcast earlier, which country do you think it'll be?
So I still think it'll be the US, because at least up to now, so when you think about the 3 Turing Award winners who developed the approach to deep learning that the last 15 years of progress have been based on, Jeff Hinton is British, Yoshua Bengio is, I think, French and then Canadian, and Yann LeCun is French. But they were all doing their work in North America. I think it's likely, because the US serves as an attractor for the most talented people, it'll come from the US. But the US is doing its best to drive talent out of the country and to prevent talented people from coming to the country. So it could be, I'm seeing, definitely there's a move back to Europe from scientists. So it could end up being someone in London or someone in Paris.
Yeah. Which application of AI keeps you up at night?
Applications, I would say lethal autonomous weapons.
Yeah, which we didn't get to in detail, but that's something I think we could have spent some time on. I like this question. Who do you think are the ultimate decision makers today in deciding the evolution of the path of AI? Companies or governments or society?
At the moment, it's companies. I think society, by and large, does not want AGI. When you ask people, they say no. That would be bonkers, right? Why would we ever do that? But the companies are going to do it anyway. And by and large, they've been able to bend the governments to their will.
Just last one quick question. Books that you would recommend to our viewers to read, and guests that you would recommend for us to have on the podcast?
Well, besides my own books, which you mentioned, the textbook AI, A Modern Approach, and Human Compatible, which was my attempt to outline an approach where we could build human-level intelligent systems that would remain under human control. So it's a potential solution for the control problem. I think Max Tegmark's Life 3.0 is another good introduction to both the potential and the risk of creating superhuman intelligence. He's a physicist, so it's got all kinds of cool physics stuff in there as well. I think Brian Christian's The Alignment Problem is a good exploration, not just of the long-term problem of control, but also ways in which it's manifesting itself now in misalignments of all kinds with existing AI systems. So those are some good recommendations. And then people, the authors of those books, I think Max and Brian are articulate, interesting people to talk to. Joshua Bengio, I think Demis Hassabis is also a very, very sharp contributor. So those would be the people I'd want to talk to.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Russell, for taking out so much of your time and thinking so thoughtfully about all the questions we put forth and the issues we discussed. So it's been a pleasure and a privilege to have that time with you. And thank you again. And I hope we'll see you in India soon.
I'll be there. Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you very much.